Hi, I'm Terry Young. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Reasonable Discourse with my colleague Shawn McAvoy. As today we discuss something that you probably haven't heard discussed on any other news source. Okay, I'm lying about that, but it's the 2016 presidential election. And Shawn, it's been an interesting process so far. We'll look at both parties, but if we were to look at the Republican Party, I think the big storyline so far has been the rise of what's been referred to as the anti-establishment candidates. Why has that happened?
The anti-establishment movement seems to be a fairly recent one politically, especially since probably in the most recent incarnation since Obama has taken office. There seems to be, on the far right in particular, this idea that not only has politics failed, but the very nature of how politics is conducted is being done wrong. Compromise is seen as a bad thing by many people in this group. They want complete outsiders, untainted by Washington or even state government, to go in there for what they hope will be a house cleaning.
So basically folks are thinking that everything associated with government, especially at the national level, is broken. So they don't want anyone who's really associated with that process. Mm-hmm. And the two, I guess the two clearest anti-establishment candidates in the Republican primary so far would be, of course, Donald Trump and also Ben Carson. Is Donald Trump really an anti-establishment kind of guy?
Well, he looks certainly anti-establishment in as much as he's never held his own political office. Of course, he's Donald Trump. He is a multi-billionaire. He probably has paid for at least a third of all the congressmen's campaigns who are in Congress right now. He knows how to lobby and get what he wants out of politicians. Really, in that sense, he is not an outsider whatsoever. He simply has not tied himself down to a particular government job. But then again, that's the nature of a lot of these insurgents anyway. They're not truly from the middle of nowhere. They tend to know what's going on and how to manipulate in Washington.
And the other candidate who's polled well so far as the anti-establishment candidate, someone who's been involved less in politics than Donald Trump, has been Ben Carson. What has Ben Carson's appeal been to Republican voters?
So far, he seems to be mostly appealing to the evangelical Christian wing of the party, more on social issues. He's really playing up his medical doctor status. That seems to be really where his base of support is, and it's interesting to watch that with both Trump and Carson, it seems that the Tea Party is not completely sure which one it wants to back or how many of them want to back. The more socially conservative are going for Ben Carson, but many of them are looking to Trump for fiscal conservatism. So the far right has almost seen an embarrassment of riches in these two.
And it seems like if you look at polls, that if you combine the numbers of Carson and Trump, that they seem to encompass about 50% of potential Republican voters, at least at the moment. Mm-hmm. There's one polling number that I think probably may provide some relief to those who are not fans of Ben Carson or Donald Trump, and that's the fact that about 70% of Republican voters say they are undecided at this point. But certainly so far, it's been Ben Carson and Donald Trump who have dominated the narrative anyway about the Republican primary process.
And even worse for establishment candidates, the two who are considered the most favored by the Republican establishment, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, when you put their numbers together, they don't even have 10% right now of Republican votes. So, yeah, it certainly looks like the age of the anti-establishment candidate. But let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Since we're discussing people like Trump and Carson, as a political scientist and an historian, what chance would such a person, a truly anti-establishment person, have in actually running the country, considering what the president has to do, what they actually can get done? Is there a reasonable hope that such a president would work?
You know, I don't think we'll even have to get that far in the narrative, because and we may have to burn this tape before the 2016 election, but I don't see either Ben Carson or Donald Trump being able to win the Republican nomination. But I think you do bring up a good point about governing. If you know, I think it would be a real challenge for someone who is a consummate outsider who gets into the White House by bashing everyone in Washington to suddenly have to turn around and, even if they're members of his own party, work with those individuals to get things done. That I think that would have to be a challenge, because when you hear, certainly from Donald Trump, I mean, I think part of his appeal is the fact that he is uncompromising, that he's tough, and I think Americans may have missed that attitude, but as we've discussed before, that's part of the problem in Washington, D.C. right now. The inability to compromise, or the lack of willingness to compromise, has created a lot of the problems that we seem to have in government today. But I will argue that it won't matter. And let's talk a little bit about the establishment candidates. There are some political scientists who argue that there is something called the invisible primary. You know, that we can look at polls from the various states and see that Donald Trump and Ben Carson seem to be doing well, but within the party establishment, individuals start to coalesce around a particular candidate. And you mentioned the two main establishment candidates at this point, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio. I will say this, you know, I told my students in my political science class last year, when we were talking 2 years out from the presidential election, that I honestly thought that Jeb Bush would be the Republican nominee. I don't feel very certain about that prediction at this point, because as you mentioned, polling-wise, Jeb Bush is just doing horrible, not only from a national poll perspective, but even within individual states. Places like Oklahoma, he's at 3%. South Carolina, he's in single digits. Even in Florida, the state where he had a fairly successful governorship, he is below double digits. And in the most recent debate, he was sort of humiliated by Marco Rubio, who most pundits believed had one of the stronger debate performances. So his campaign is struggling, despite the fact that he was getting far more super PAC money than any other candidate in the race from either party. Recently, he's had to cut back on campaign staff. He has said in a town hall meeting that there are a lot of things that he'd much rather enjoy doing than running for president. He just doesn't sound like the guy who is going to be the Republican nominee. Certainly people aren't supporting him. I think the only state in which he's at double digits right now, or most polls I've seen, now several states, would be Texas, where his brother, of course, had been governor. But even there, he's in 4th place or so. So he's really struggling. And I think a lot of people looked at Jeb Bush several years ago as a strong potential candidate in the Republican field. I think he's certainly been giving a lot of thought to running for president, yet he has at times seemed unprepared. For example, he would have to know that one of the things as a Bush that he would have to respond to would be questions about his brother's presidency, yet he struggled to really have a strong response to those questions, and he's gone back and forth. And we'll talk about on the other side, somebody who doesn't seem to have anticipated what might happen if they ran for president. But why do you think, you know, Jeb Bush is a guy who comes from this prominent political family? Why do you think he's struggling?
Unfortunately, it's partially because he comes from that political family. The Bush presidency, even though it seemed to be, at least at the time, a very successful one for the right, Bush was not unanimously beloved on the right. He had ideas and programs that did not sit well. His form of neoconservatism was what you would call in modern parlance big government conservatism. There was very little fiscal responsibility in the Bush administration. And that's on top of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which not even conservatives were 100% behind necessarily. So Jeb Bush is having to run, in a way, he's got to carry the baggage of his brother's presidency. Not fair at all, perhaps, but that's the American political landscape, just as Hillary Clinton is not going to get away from the fact she's married to Bill Clinton.
Right, and you know, I think it's interesting that you talked about the lack of budgetary restraint in the Bush administration, because Jeb Bush, on an interview with Stephen Colbert, basically said, you know, I'm going to make sure that we don't spend irresponsibly. And you know, Colbert asked, so you're saying you would be more conservative than your brother? And I think that was what he was hinting at. Certainly, among Republican voters. We
Right.
know that traditionally candidates seem to move more towards the middle as they get to the general election, but to win your party, you have to be a little more to the extreme, and Jeb Bush has struggled. And I'll say this about Donald Trump, although I said I don't think he's going to end up being the nominee, one thing that he has done, I think, quite brilliantly is he has had Jeb Bush. I think he looked at Jeb Bush as his biggest rival, and he's had him on the defensive from almost the beginning, going after Jeb Bush and even calling into question whether or not Jeb Bush's brother, George W. Bush, was responsible somehow for not preventing the 9/11 attacks. And I don't think most folks believe that, yet Jeb Bush had to spend time defending his brother. And I think Trump has really knocked Jeb Bush off of his game, and I think it's showing in the polls.
Oh, Trump is good at that. He was one of the main figures behind the birther movement. To this day, Obama still has to deal with questions about whether or not he's actually an American citizen. Donald Trump was a major force behind pushing that particular issue. So to give him credit, or to give the devil his due, Trump is very good at coming out of the gate, defining his opponent, how he wants that opponent defined, and letting the opponent struggle in the wind trying to figure out how to respond.
And I think if we look at those anti-establishment candidates, and I said I don't expect either Ben Carson or Donald Trump to win the nomination ultimately, you know, they have had staying power. I mean, they have, you know, Donald Trump has been near the top of the polls, although he's actually lost some ground to Ben Carson, has been near the top now for about 3 months, something that, you know, 4 years ago, Herman Cain was briefly the anti-establishment guy who was at the top of the polls, but that didn't last long. But where I think Donald Trump may have problems is the fact that you talked about the evangelical Christians and other social conservatives. When they start looking in more detail at Donald Trump's position on certain social issues, I'm not sure they're going to like what they see. What do you think about that issue?
Well, considering that Donald Trump has a tendency to ally with whichever political party benefits him at the time, I mean, he has been a Republican, he's also been a Democrat, he's also been an independent. At one point, he was in the Reform Party. Mm-hmm. He is a survivor. The thing is, survivors have a tendency to back whichever horse is in the lead. Conservatives, the social conservatives, evangelical Christians don't like that. Mm-hmm. They want someone who sticks with the line. Here's a party line, we don't deviate from it, it never changes. That's where I'm actually surprised at Trump, that there is the trouble on the far right deciding between Carson and Trump. Personally, I would have thought that Carson would have walked away with the far right.
Right, I agree with you. And I think Ben Carson has been very effective at saying, look, these are my core values, these are my beliefs. And if you share those beliefs, then support me. Where I think Ben Carson may struggle is the fact that, and Trump has called him out on his personality. He said he's very low key, and you know, and that has been Carson's approach. He's sort of stayed out of the fray as far as attacking the other candidates, other Republicans. But when you start to look at the details of some of the positions that he's taking, he's talked about, based on tithing, having a 10% flat tax rate, and then you look at what economists and other candidates say, that, you know, you're talking about blowing up America's debt, you know, that would be horrific for the country and things like that. I'm not sure his positions are well defined at the moment. Maybe they don't have to be, but I think when people start going after those specific positions, I'm not sure he's going to have the ability, because that political background is absent, to be able to defend those positions and keep the momentum going. But he certainly, you would think that the evangelical Christians within the Republican Party will strongly support him, as they have. And he certainly looks to be in good shape for the first contest, the Iowa caucus, where if you look back in 2012, Rick Santorum won. In 2008, Mike Huckabee won, and again, in large part because the Iowa caucus has a lot of evangelical Christians who will be voting in that on the Republican side. But we have to keep in mind, we know that Mike Huckabee and Rick Santorum didn't get anywhere close to winning the Republican nomination. I'd like to talk about someone we haven't discussed yet, and that is Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz has been somewhat restrained in this race because he seems to be targeting the same groups that Donald Trump and Ben Carson are going after, as far as the Tea Party movement, the evangelical Christians. And he's even tried to fashion himself, like Trump has, as an outsider. Now, here's the problem for Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is someone who's serving in the United States Senate, so he's in Washington, D.C. He is someone who actually had a low-level position in the Bush administration. And his wife is employed by one of the largest investment banking firms in the world. So can he really pass, so Wall Street is what we're screaming here. Can he really pass himself off as a political outsider with all those things, I guess, characteristics that he has?
Can he? Sure he can. If it's one thing the American public has proven time and time again, we will swallow any bizarre amount of bull hockey you give us if you package it correctly. Joseph Goebbels saying, repeat the big lie often enough, people will believe it. We will. Now the question is, will he get a chance to?
The other person that you did mention who I think may be in a very good position right now is the other mainstream candidate other than Jeb Bush, and that's Marco Rubio. He has performed well in the Republican debates. And as the establishment starts to look at their options with the struggles of Jeb Bush, isn't it possible that by default, if nothing else, that Marco Rubio will be the guy who will get the attention of that segment of the party?
Entirely possible. The speaking that Rubio has been doing, and although it's not covered as much as Trump's colorful campaign, shows that Rubio is really positioning himself for what I would call the forgotten conservatives. He's positioning himself for the moderate Republicans, the people who really are not comfortable with a Ted Cruz, Ben Carson dominated party. There's a lot of them. They don't always feel well represented. It was, like you said, Jeb Bush was supposed to be the anointed candidate. Rubio's in a perfect position. If indeed Jeb Bush pulls out of the race, and the indications certainly look like he might be forced into it, Rubio would be in a perfect position to capture the moderate Republicans. He also could probably appeal to the conservative Democrats. So he's someone the establishment would definitely want to look at.
Right, and I think he does model himself as a conservative. So I don't think that the evangelical Christians or the Tea Partiers would necessarily feel like they are, basically putting away their values to support Marco Rubio, if that's what it comes down to. So he may be in the best position. We'll see. I think he is in good shape, and certainly a lot of that money that's going to Jeb Bush right now from the PACs, if he can't get his campaign going, then you would think that Rubio would be the beneficiary of some of that money. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Maybe we'll give our predictions later on. Let's go ahead and shift over to the Democrats. And just as I mentioned that it was a bit surprising that so many people had considered the fact that Jeb Bush would eventually run for the Republican nomination, that he seemed to be unprepared to deal with questions about his brother. Is it shocking to you that someone who probably everybody in America knew in 2008 when she lost the Democratic campaign to Barack Obama that she would be running in 2016 if Barack Obama were elected in 2012, that Hillary Clinton would allow herself to use a private server for emails?
It certainly raises a question of, is there something about marrying Bill Clinton that makes judgment lapse? It just does seem strange, and yet it has happened. Here she is running in 2015 for the 2016 nomination, if she can get it. She's already made missteps, granted every candidate will, but in her case, she's, again, like Jeb Bush, she's already under a disability, in as much as she's married to Bill Clinton. Just because her last name is Clinton, you can guarantee probably 20% of the electorate will vote against her.
Sure.
Her first name's Hillary, and we know Hillary, therefore another 20-25% are going to vote against her. She's already going to be fighting against long odds. And for something like that, it's almost like she's just not paying attention.
Yeah, it's really surprising that if you are looking ahead to the opportunity to run for president again, that you would recognize as Secretary of State that every action you took would have an impact on that. And so that's why it was just surprising to me. But I think she may suffer from Two of the things that perhaps plagued her husband, one, just this sort of belief, or at least acting as if the rules that apply to everyone else don't necessarily apply to you, and we saw that several times within the Clinton administration. And then the other thing is this idea of taking on positions as they are politically expedient to do so. Her chief opposition right now, with Joe Biden deciding he was not going to get into this race, of course, is Bernie Sanders, the independent senator from Vermont. And we have seen, because he's definitely a leftist-leaning senator, very liberal senator, that Hillary Clinton seemingly has decided that on certain positions that she has to move to the left. Again, common in primary elections. She's moved to the left, but in doing so, that meant she has refuted past positions she's taken on things like the Keystone Pipeline, or on same-sex marriage, or on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, she's changed her views, and you would think that would open her up in the general election campaign to lots of video clips of her saying one thing and then turning around and saying another thing. Do you think that's something that would be costly to her in a general election campaign?
It will be, depending on what the issue is. And that's one reason why, as you know, historically, Americans do not elect people straight out of Congress, for example, to be president. If you do have too long a record, and Hillary counts being both a senator and a secretary of state, you have things we can run on. And changing your mind, and she did point out, and to be fair to her, it's an accurate assessment. People do change their minds on things. That is true. In politics, however, voters don't care. They like the idea that you had an issue, you had a position on it since you were 4 years old, and you've been with it all the last 80 years. So changing your mind is not allowed. She has done a lot of it, whether it was legitimate because she changed her mind or she changed her position for politics. Something, at least one of these, will bite her in the tail if she manages to get the Democratic nomination. But that brings me to another issue, because the Democrats give us another unique situation. In particular, with the Republicans, you have two establishment candidates, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, neither doing particularly well. With the Democrats, we seem to have no establishment candidates. Hillary's not it. Certainly isn't Bernie Sanders. What is going on with the Republican or the Democratic Party, I should say, that it seems the establishment has no representation?
Well, you know, I think Hillary certainly, I think, considers herself to embrace a large scope of the Democratic Party. I really believe that she is in an excellent position. I think what Bernie Sanders did from the left is what Trump and Carson have been able to do on the right. He's certainly been the populist candidate, you know, looking at the income disparity and issues like that, that the middle class and lower class have been sort of left out of the political process, and he's, you know, he really was able to capture that so far and do very well. And there's a real strong chance he's going to win the New Hampshire primary. But if you look at the other states, though, Hillary has been way ahead in the Democratic polls. I think that's why Joe Biden ultimately decided, I mean, he said he wasn't afraid to get into the race, and he did very well in general election polls, but he was way behind Hillary when you looked at Democratic polls. I think she's in real good shape right now. And one thing I think she has to be careful. She's been more aggressive towards Bernie Sanders. She has to make sure that she doesn't alienate his supporters, because you know, if you anticipate it being a close election, which I think it will be unless one of those anti-establishment guys wins the Republican primary, I think Hillary may be in a real good position if that happened. I think that Hillary Clinton is going to have to be able to get some level of enthusiastic support from the liberals in the Democratic Party in order to win the general election. Now, I would disagree with you about, or say something a little bit differently between her and Jeb Bush. Her husband, Hillary Clinton's husband, left the White House with a lot better approval ratings than Jeb Bush's brother left the White House. Though both, I think, have done a great deal to rehabilitate the way they're viewed in their years since they've left the White House. So I'm not sure that Bill Clinton will be a hindrance as much as a help. I mean, Bill Clinton was beloved in large segments of the Democratic community. You know, I think there are surveys that show that if you ask Americans today who the best presidents have been in history, typically Ronald Reagan is number one, then it's Abe Lincoln, then it's Bill Clinton. Americans don't like to thumb through the history books too much, right?
Yeah.
You know, that takes too much effort. So, you know, I think they look back at the fact that it was the time of economic prosperity, that we actually had a budget surplus, at least on an annual basis. And despite all his many horrific scandals, I mean, I think people tend to look at those positive things for him. And here's one thing I would say about Hillary Clinton that for her, that she unfortunately does not have that Bill Clinton had. And Bill Clinton is probably one of the best politicians. You know, I think about however you want to rank these guys as presidents. I think you look at somebody like Ronald Reagan and you look at somebody like Bill Clinton. They were master politicians, and I don't know that Hillary is anywhere close to that. Although we have to say this about all the scandals related to the email controversy, related to the hearings on Benghazi. She seems to be coming out of that stronger than she's been in several months.
Right.
And you know, we don't know what else might flash up at any time related to that. But she seems to do her best when she's sort of backed into the corner. You know, she really didn't get into the 2008 campaign until she was in desperate straits against Barack Obama, and it was just a little too late to be able to pull it out. And so maybe the Bernie Sanders challenge ultimately will, and these other things that have happened may be a good thing to get her campaign going. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
One question for you.
Sure.
Because although a small possibility, it is a possibility. Let's say that indeed we do get a Republican candidate who is a little more establishment. Let's say Marco Rubio for sake of argument, but it could be, you know, Ted Cruz. You have Hillary Clinton, who almost definitely will be the Democratic nominee, I think. This is Donald Trump we're talking about. Just because he gave a promise that I have a feeling his fingers are crossed behind his back for, that he would not run as an independent, I honestly would be shocked if he did not run. What would you think about walking into 16 with Trump as an independent? Do you think he would do well at all in the Electoral College among the voters?
He wouldn't have to do all of that well to make a big difference in the campaign. I mean, I think he would certainly draw from those who are just disenchanted with the way things are done in Washington, and not just Republicans. I mean, I think there would be independents, and you know, because if you look at how he's doing so far right now, a long ways from the general election, he's done well in the general election polls. Generally, his numbers are starting to come down, in part because Clinton's are going up. But I think he would draw some Democrats, but I think certainly he would be his campaign would be much more damaging, I think, to the Republican presidential candidate. Now, you mentioned Ted Cruz again, and I would say I'm not sure Cruz can. I would call him maybe I'm buying what he's selling about the anti-establishment. and one thing that I didn't mention about him is that he's not beloved by those who are entrenched within the Republican Party. And I thought it was real interesting when Donald Trump was out there saying that George W. Bush should have prevented 9/11 from happening. You know, George W. Bush gave a speech at a private fundraiser for his brother. And he says, there's one guy I have to tell you I really don't like. And you would think that would be Donald Trump, but no, it was Ted Cruz. And apparently by folks who know Ted Cruz, I mean, they respect him as an intelligent man, but he's not very well liked. So if he wins the nomination, I just wonder if everybody in the establishment will get behind him. I think Marco Rubio won't have that problem with establishment Republicans, and I think he will do well with evangelicals and with Tea Partiers to an extent. Although he may have hurt himself with the fact that he's been absent a lot in the U.S. Senate. Jeb Bush unsuccessfully went after him on that, and he could have said he wasn't running for the Senate in a very noble fashion. You know, I'm not going to run because it's not fair to the people of Florida for me to be running for two offices. I aspire to be president, so I'm not going to run for Senate. But instead, he basically said, you know what, it really stinks to be a senator, and that's why I'm not running. and so I'm not sure how that's going to play out. But let's talk about the general election. You know, it's still a ways off, okay? And I'm going to make my predictions, and I'll let you make your prediction, and then As far as who will win each party's nomination, then let's look at some trends that may be positive for Republicans and some trends that may be positive for Democrats. Right now, I'm changing up. I said for a long time I thought it was going to be Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush in a battle to maintain America's monarchy with either the Bush dynasty or the Clinton dynasty. But now I really believe it's going to be Hillary Clinton and Marco Rubio as the candidates. That's my guess. What would yours be?
I would have to say the same thing. Hillary Clinton almost definitely is going to be the Democratic nominee, partially because I can't imagine how Bernie Sanders will appeal to even conservative Democrats. On the Republican side, almost definitely it will be Marco Rubio. I would alter that a little bit by saying I still think there's about a 40% chance that we're going to see an independent Donald Trump there as well.
Yeah, I think that would certainly throw the election, and I think that would be something Republicans might not want to see. Well, let's talk about some of the things that if someone's a Republican watching this, that they can take some comfort in, and if someone's a Democrat, we'll talk about some things maybe that they can take comfort in. If we look back, going all the way back to 1952, we've only had one stretch since that time period where one party has won 3 consecutive elections. And that was when the Republicans won the 1980, 1984, and 1988 presidential elections, so that there were Republicans in the White House for 12 years. In all the other cases, it's only been 8
We're
years.
trading presidents.
Yeah,
Yep.
and now, admittedly, in 2000, obviously Al Gore won the popular vote by about 500,000 votes over George W. Bush, but did not win the Electoral College. So it was close. The Democrats were close to doing it. What is it you think why does 8 years seem to be the limit at this point for sticking with one party in the White House?
I think partially an opportunity. I think part of it is structural because we only allow a president 2 terms. I would be interested to see if that term limit were altered to say 3 terms. Would we allow a president in for 3 terms? I don't know that we would. Would we still see the same switching of parties? That would be an interesting thing to see. But I do think right now it's partially structural. We get to the end of an 8-year period, and we just sort of choose the next thing which is different, and almost always it's the opposite party.
Yeah.
And then, wait, it's a form of laziness, I suppose.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so. I mean, if you are a Republican, I think you have to look and say, hey, okay, it's been 8 years with the Democrat in the White House, or it will be by the time we get to the 2016 election. If that pattern holds, then things may look good for the Republican candidate. Related to that, a lot of times presidents, by the time they're late in their administration, their approval ratings typically have gone downhill a bit. There are certainly exceptions to that, but even someone like Ronald Reagan was hovering, this point in, 7 years into his presidency was right just above 50% because of, in part because of the Iran-Contra scandal. Bill Clinton actually had a little bit higher approval rating, but yet, if you look at Clinton's rating was at 58% in his 7th year, but it wasn't good enough for Al Gore to win. Barack Obama's right now, it's been, I guess, on an upward trend slightly. It's within 45, 46, 47%, so he's not down in the low 40s. But still, it's hard to see what impact that may have, because there have been times where presidents have been very popular. Dwight D. Eisenhower had approval ratings above 60%, 7 years into his second term, or 7 years into his term as president, yet Nixon couldn't win the 1960 election, so it may have no impact. If you are a Democrat, one thing that I think may be encouraging is just looking at the Electoral College results from 2012. In the 2012 election, everyone was saying, hey, you have to watch what's going on in Virginia, what's going on in Florida, what's going on in Ohio. And of course, Barack Obama ended up winning all 3 of those states, though Florida was extremely tight. He won that over Mitt Romney. But yet, had Romney won all 3 of those states, he still would have lost the election. So if you're a Democrat, you have those 3 states, and you would assume that if Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush end up being the nominee, that they would do very well in Florida. Especially since it's been a close win for Democrats the last 2 elections. So that would take that outplay. Then you have Ohio, which with Hillary Clinton's strength among labor unions may be tough to wrest from her. But even if they can get Ohio and Virginia and Florida, they're still going to have to get Colorado or Nevada or some other state out there to tip the scale. So I think Democrats can look at that and say, well, from the popular vote perspective, Democrats have won 3 of the last 4 elections. The other thing to keep in mind, whoever wins this election in 2016, they have to feel good about their chances in 2020, because if you go back all the way to 1932, only twice have we had incumbents running in a presidential election to lose, and that was Gerald Ford. Oh, I'm sorry, I should say 3 times. Gerald Ford in 1976 lost in a close election. Jimmy Carter lost badly to Ronald Reagan in 1980. And then in 1992, George W. Bush lost to Bill Clinton, and also
George H.W. Bush.
I'm sorry, George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton, and something that the Republicans probably don't want to think about, a strong third-party candidate, a reasonably strong third-party candidate, in H. Ross Perot. So I don't think the Republicans want to see Donald Trump pop up as that third-party candidate, but who knows?
We'll find out.
Well, like I said, if we're completely off base and it ends up being Ben Carson against Bernie Sanders, we'll just throw this tape away and never let it see the light of day again. But thanks for watching us. I'm Terry Young, and this is Shawn McAvoy, and thanks for being with us on another episode of Reasonable Discourse.
Good evening.